We often go over how we build our worlds and the pitfalls and perils that go along with it. We love using examples of things done wrong, but more than anything, we love the deep cuts. Playing with our format a little bit this week, I'm going to share with you some of the films that have inspired me most in my world building. We're going to do this every now and again for different genres, and this week we're going to be looking at sci-fi and fantasy. These are some of the best examples of when things go right. We're going to talk about how it relates to your work. So, without further ado, I'm DC Ferguson, and this is the World Building Dojo. Anybody can give you a top 10 list with some of the most fun and enjoyable sci fi and fantasy films, but like I said, we love the deep cuts. So, the films on this list are often overlooked and relegated to cult favorite status. The first one on our list is the 1988 fantasy film Willow, starring Warwick Davis and Val Kilmer. Our plot is pretty stock fantasy fare. We have the evil Queen Bavmorda, who's heard of a prophecy that will end her reign with a child born with a special birthmark. The baby is born and smuggled away into the hands of Willow, a dwarf with dreams of being a great sorcerer one day. As he takes the child and flees, he joins with a swordsman named Madmartigan. They're hunted by the queen's daughter Sorsha, but they turn their little rebellion into a full-on revolt against the queen. The handling of this story is done with a very sure hand, thanks in part to the amazing writing talent of George Lucas. Everyone goes on about Star Wars and how disappointing the later prequel trilogy was, but they often forget he wrote American Graffiti, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Willow, among others. And he doesn't skimp on the world building in this one either. Scenes in the dwarven village of Nelwyn give a glimpse that the dwarves have their own customs and lives that differ greatly from the rest of the world. The trek across the land with Madmartigan brings them in contact with the rarely seen fantasy creatures called brownies. It tells a high fantasy story that brings kids into the theater, is heartwarming, and it has a romantic element for mom, and Madmartigan really is a badass with a sword for dad. Without a doubt, juggling a fantasy film while also trying to be a family movie is no easy feat, and the flow of Lucas's story makes it look simple. This is my go-to fantasy movie to point to when you want to look at how high fantasy can be done while blending other genres. A touch of humor, a touch of romance, emotional character development, and you don't need to learn 600 made-up fantasy characters' names to keep the story straight. Where it lacks on the scale of, say, a Lord of the Rings, you walk away from the film with a feeling of charm, as opposed to the massive undertaking that is that 8-hour trilogy. That's not to say that one is better than the other, but Willow does tell a tale and show how a contained fantasy story can be done start to finish. Before he was Neo in The Matrix, Keanu Reeves starred in the often overlooked 1995 cyberpunk film Johnny Mnemonic. In the far distant future of 2021, anyway, Johnny is a data courier, basically a smuggler of digital information. That information is stored on a hard drive in his head. He has no idea what data is in his brain, he just brings it from one place to another. That is, of course, until he finds out that he's carrying information that the Yakuza want to cut his head off for, and download the information for themselves. Along the way, he finds an ally in Jane, a mercenary for hire with some back-alley cybernetic enhancements. They're hunted by some pretty memorable villains for the Yakuza as Johnny desperately tries to get whatever data's in his head out of him before it kills him. Now, putting aside the third act, which really kind of jumps the shark, or dolphin as it were, Johnny Mnemonic understands cyberpunk really well, and its world building is very realized for what amounts to an action movie. Cyberpunk is all about style, and that's what we've come to the table for. It's not enough to just have all this cool, big budget CGI future stuff and flashy screens. We've seen what happens when we do that, and it isn't pretty. What we want to do is understand the impact that this technology has had on humanity, which we touch on in the film with the introduction of low-techs and underground resistance movement against the overreach of technology. We see Jane, who wants to compete at the top level of the food chain for these mercenaries, but doesn't have the budget for the high-end cybernetics those guys are using. This is the kind of detail and critical questions I've constantly mentioned that you want to ask yourself about technology and magic in your world. Consider the effect of these powers on society as a whole and let it ripple through your world building. This is one of the most fun parts of storytelling in your world, including little cheeky references to how things are different in your world that go on outside the main story in a way that gives the reader a clue to how your world lives when your hero isn't there. This film is heavily inspired my cyberpunk urban fantasy series, the Dragon's Dream saga. From wet drives to cybernetic enhancements for the masses, I really wanted to touch on how the Tetrarch Corporation changed technology and the resurgence of magic has flipped the world upside down. I can't recommend this film enough for both its entertainment value and for its flair of style and its world building. Oh, the lessons, folks. The cornucopia of lessons we get from this film cannot be understated. First of all, some of you saw this movie and wondered what it's even doing on the list. Make no mistake about it, Big Trouble in Little China is straight up urban fantasy, no two ways about it. What did you think it was? Action? Comedy? Well, you're right there too, and that's why this film is so genius. The movie centers around good old Jack Burton and his friend Wang. Wang's girlfriend has been abducted by a millennia-old sorcerer named Lo Pan and protected by his guardians Rain, Thunder, and Lightning. Jack's truck has been taken by Lo Pan's gang and he retreats with Wang to come up with a plan to rescue Wang's girlfriend and his truck. So, first lesson here is one you've heard me say many times. If your sidekick is more interesting than your main character, guess what? They aren't your main character. If you look at the character arc of this story, Wang is the hero, boldly going forth into danger with his martial arts skills to save the woman that he loves. But Kurt Russell's Jack Burton is a braggart, a loudmouth, he's charismatic, and just plain overshadows Wang by how over the top he is. He steals every scene he's in. And while studio executives rarely make good decisions about writing, they went back and shot additional scenes that put Jack at the forefront of the film. This was an incredibly wise move, as I don't think the film could have the cult status it has if it wasn't for Kurt Russell's amazing character. This film also is an amazing cross-genre beast, juggling Eastern mysticism with magic and kung fu, monsters, and comedy like it doesn't even want to stay in its lane. The movie never loses pace thanks to some really clean, concise writing, putting action set pieces in and knowing when to add the jokes. Take careful notice when you watch this, especially where it puts humor. When an action scene kicks in, breaks for humor mark like the beginning and ends of scenes. They never lose momentum on the tension they build. As a fun fact, this movie was originally written as a Western, if you can believe that. Now, before you scoff, this movie is so awesome just the way it is. Wouldn't say otherwise. But imagine for a second that this was a Western with Jack Burton searching for his stolen horse while fighting off Eastern sorcerers. It sounds pretty cool, right? The reason I mention that is the scope of this film's writing was always ambitious, crossing over genres like it's jumping hurdles. Like I said, so many lessons from this film. Watch it once to enjoy it, and then watch it again and take notes. When it comes to prolific sci-fi storytellers, very few people could ever hope to hold a candle to Philip K. Dick. Who is this guy, you ask? Well, I'm not really that surprised if you haven't heard of him, and I can't tell you how tragic that is. Philip K. Dick was a sci-fi writer, with the vast majority of his major works coming out between the 60s and 70s. At the time, sci-fi writers around the world were saying that he was one of the greatest science fiction authors alive, but the literary world didn't really think anything of him. As such, he never saw a lot of push or spotlight, and sadly he died poor in 1982. What's so great about what he wrote? Well, The Man in the High Castle, Blade Runner, Total Recall, The Minority Report, Screamers, The Adjustment Bureau, A Scanner Darkly, Imposter, Next, and the film we're talking about, Paycheck. If you've never heard of this man, you need to go out and grab every book you can find and read it before Hollywood makes another movie out of it. There are easily 4 or 5 of his stories circulating Hollywood at any given time being optioned for screenplays. He's that good. So, getting back to the story, Michael Jennings is a reverse engineer. He takes a competitor's latest tech, breaks it down to figure out how it works, and then gives that knowledge to his employer, whoever that might be. Because what he's doing amounts to corporate espionage, he undergoes memory wipes to forget he's ever worked on the project, protecting both him and his employer with plausible deniability. When he's offered a long-term 3-year project, he comes out the other side with a guarantee of $92 million. The only thing is, when he does come out, he finds that he signed it all away in exchange for 12 random items. As the FBI move in on him, he finds out that each one of these items is allowing him to evade capture, leading him to realize it has something to do with the future. I can't spoil a thing about this movie if you've never seen it. It's just so good. Easily one of my favorite sci-fi films of all time. What makes this film so wonderful from a world building perspective is how well realized it is. The choice to place it in a world just a little more technological than our own makes it feel grounded. Like you could see this research being done at a Silicon Valley R&D department a decade from now. It's believable and it's smart, and the story is so wonderfully twisty and turny, giving us satisfaction when we see how one of the 12 items is being used. Another story packed with lessons. This sets the bar for grounded, real-world sci-fi that feels possible. I was never going to be able to make a list like this and not include this film at basically the top spot. When people ask me what The Wicked Instruments is about, I say it's a fantasy comedy, like The Princess Bride. There's no other film to compare it to, and I can't say enough about how much this influenced my writing of that series and storytelling as a whole. The story of Wesley and Buttercup, or the Dread Pirate Roberts and the Princess to Be, is one of romance, comedy, and fantasy. He seeks to save the love of his life from Prince Humperdinck, trying to force her to marry him. Meanwhile, a group of outlaws seeks to ransom her off to the prince, while a man in black seeks to rescue her. This movie is another bevy of lessons. The subplot of Inigo Montoya has made him one of the most iconic side characters in fantasy movie history. The movie is incredibly quotable, juggles genres like our other examples, and it ends up with a movie that is perfect for date night, family night, or just sitting by yourself in the dark and crying about how wonderful love is. Whatever floats your boat, the master of Kung Fu and friendship does not judge. When we look at the world of Florin, we don't find an incredible amount of fleshing out of the background like we do in, say, Willow in our previous example. This movie stays very contained to a core host of memorable characters, and in that regard it kind of has a fairy tale aspect to it, but there's a lesson in that too. Sometimes you don't need to create a fictional language or understand what rituals a religious sect in your town practices in order to tell a concise and enjoyable story. Remember always, the story comes first, and if some parts of the cool world building that you did don't advance that story, we cut and cut mercilessly. This is a great example of what happens when you strip down your story to the bare minimum of world building that it needs in order to tell it. From rats of unusual size to the kooky miracle Max in the woods, the amount of world that you show only needs to be enough to enjoy the story you're telling. When it's done so well like this film, you can't imagine changing anything. I hope you enjoyed this list, but more importantly, I hope you found some new films to watch to better understand how to examine things with a critical eye, and may they inform your own writing as much as they have mine. So, next time I do one of these, what genre do you guys want to see me touch on? Post in the comments down below. I try to reply to everybody. Also, check the links in the description box down there too. You can sign up for my newsletter and get all the latest goings on with the Dragon's Dream saga. Help out the Master of Kung Fu and Friendship by hitting that like and subscribe button to hear about new videos. And as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.